On behalf of MLGE Societies, Manikchand Pahade Law College, Aurangabad, I would like to welcome our resource person for today, Advocate Shrikant Advant sir. Sir has completed his BSc LLB with outstanding academic performance. Sir has a very vast and diverse experience in the field of law. Sir has expertise over subjects like constitutional law, banking law, and contract law. Sir has practiced law for more than 30 years in Honorable High Court, District Court, and DRT. So, without any further ado, I now request Advocate Shrikant Advant sir to please address today's webinar. Over to you, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the generous introduction. I sincerely thank Principal Dr. Shirsat sir, Professor More sir, Sri Vyas sir, and all the faculty members of MP Law College for giving me an opportunity to conduct this session of the webinar for the preparation of Law CET. Sri Kolte sir has on 23rd of July updated you about the general principles of Contract Act. I shall now deal with chapter 8 in the second part, that is sections 124 to sections 147. As we all know, contracts govern all transactions, whether they are between firms, corporate bodies, or private individuals. Indeed, every transaction or commercial exchange has at its heart a contract. As we all know, the law relating to contract is primarily governed by Indian Contract Act 1872. The Act came into force on the first day of September 1872. The preamble to the Act says that it was enacted to define and amend certain parts of the law relating to contract. The law is by no means exhaustive framework on the law of contracts. It does not deal with all the branches of contracts. Thus, contracts relating to sale of goods, negotiable instruments, insurance, partnership are dealt with by separate statutes. The Contract Act provides conceptual clarity and deals with general principles and the rules governing contracts. The Act is divisible in two parts. The first part, from section 1 to 75, deals with general principles governing the contracts and therefore applies to all contracts irrespective of their nature. The second part, ranging from section 124 to section 238, deals with certain kinds of contracts, namely contracts of indemnity and guarantee, bailment, pledge, and agency. Before beginning with the special contracts provided in chapter 8, it is important that we quickly brush up on the definition of contract, essential elements of a contract, and its types. We have a PowerPoint presentation to graphically understand contractual terminologies and the concepts. Let us go through the slides which will facilitate us in getting the control and conspectus of the subject. The first slide lays down the building blocks of a contract. This will act as the bedrock of all the contractual transactions. The universal rule is if a contract is legal and valid, it can withstand the test of enforceability. Some critical pointers in interpretation clauses are section 2b, which states that a proposal when accepted becomes a promise. Section 2e defines an agreement as every promise and every set of promises forming consideration for each other is an agreement. An agreement is an outcome of offer and acceptance. Finally, section 2h defines an agreement enforceable at law to be termed as contract. A contract creates jus in personam, which means a right enforceable against a particular person. Now, I'll be dealing with the essential elements of a valid contract. This slide gives us a clear idea of the essential elements of a valid contract. Firstly, one cannot contract with himself. I repeat, one cannot contract with himself. A contract involves at least two parties, one party making the offer and the other party accepting it. A contract may be made by natural persons and by other persons having legal existence, such as companies, statutory authorities. Secondly, an agreement comprising of a valid offer and acceptance is crucial for an enforceable contract. Thirdly, the parties must intend to create legal obligations. Social and domestic agreements are not enforceable in the court of law, hence they do not result into contract. Fourthly, the consideration and object of the agreement must be lawful. Thereafter, the parties must consent upon the subject matter of contract in the same sense, which is also referred to as consensus ad idem. Further, such consent must be free and it must not be caused by coercion, undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation, or mistake. It is also important that parties have capacity to enter into a contract. Section 11 of the Indian Contract Act specifies that every person is competent to contract who has attained the age of majority, is of sound mind, and is not otherwise disqualified from contracting by any other law. Also, the agreement must have a certainty of meaning thereby it should be clear, certain, and unambiguous, and must clearly spell out the rights and obligations of the parties thereto. Further, the terms of agreement should be capable of performance. An agreement to do an act of impossible in itself cannot be enforced. Finally, the agreement must not be such which is expressly declared as void. An illegal agreement is prohibited by law and has no legal sanctity. Friends, as per the Indian Contract Act 1872, contracts are classified on certain broad parameters. This slide gives a flowchart and explains the different forms of contract. Let us see the contracts classified on the basis of their validity. Valid contract is an agreement which is binding and enforceable. It contains all essential elements of a valid contract. Void contract. Void contract can be located in section 2J of the Contract Act, which states, and I quote, a contract which ceases to be enforceable by law becomes void when it ceases to be enforceable, unquote. Thus, a void contract is one which cannot be enforced by a court of law. Voidable contract are found in section 2I. It says, and I quote, an agreement which is enforceable by law at the option of one or more parties thereto, but not at the option of the other or others, is a voidable contract, unquote. This in fact means where one of the parties to the agreement is in a position or is legally entitled or authorized to avoid performing his part, then the agreement is treated as voidable. Then fourth is illegal contracts. Illegal contract is one which the law forbids to be made. The court will not enforce such contract but also the connected contracts as well. It is important to understand that all the illegal agreements are void, but all void agreements are not necessarily illegal. Where a contract is good in substance, but because of some technical defect, that is absence in writing, barred by law of limitation, one or both the parties cannot sue upon it. It is described as an unenforceable contract. Contracts classified on the basis of their formation can be stated, and the first statement which I will be making with respect to express contract. If the terms are expressed by words spoken or in writing, any promise is made in words, the promise is said to be an express. Implied contracts, in contrast, come into existence by implication. Most often, the implication is by law or by action. Any promise is made otherwise than in words, the promise is said to be implied. Tacit contract. Tacit contracts are a part of implied contracts, those that are inferred through the conduct of parties without any words spoken or written. A classic example of tacit contract would be when a cash is withdrawn by a customer of a bank from the automatic teller machine, that is ATM. Another example of tacit contract is where a contract is assumed to have entered when the sale is given effect to at the fall of a hammer in an auction sale. Fourth, a quasi contract is not an actual contract, but it resembles a contract. It is created by law under certain circumstances. Fifth is e-contract are those which are entered into by two or more parties using electronic means such as emails. Performance-based contracts are classified in four heads. In a contract, the consideration could be an act or forbearance. When the act is done or executed, or the forbearance is brought on record, then the contract is an executed contract. In an executory contract, the consideration is reciprocal promise or obligation. Such consideration is to be performed in future only, and therefore these contracts are described as executory contracts. Unilateral contract is one-sided contract in which one party has performed his duty and obligation and the other party's obligation is outstanding. Bilateral contract is one where the obligation or promise is outstanding on the part of both the parties. Now with this, I'll be dealing with the subject under the caption consideration. The essential of consideration can be had from this slide. Consideration must be moved at the desire or request of the promisor. An act done at the desire of a third party is not a consideration. Second, consideration may be offered by the promisee or any other person who is not a party to the contract. In other words, it can be a stranger. There can be a stranger to a consideration, but not stranger to a contract. A consideration which consists in performance of an act is said to be executed. When it consists in a promise, it is said to be executory. The promise by one party may be the consideration for an act by some other party and vice versa. Consideration may be past, present, or future. The words has done or abstains from doing as contained in section 2D are a recognition of the doctrine of past consideration. In order to support a promise, a past consideration must move by a previous request. Consideration need not be of any particular value. It need not be approximately of equal value with the promise for which it is exchanged, but it must be something which the law would regard as having some value. Something in return need not be equal to something given. It can be considered as a bad bargain of the party, but as an exception, if it is shockingly disproportionate or less, and the other party alleges that his consent was not free and there is an inadequate consideration, then ultimately everything will have to be proved in the evidence. Consideration must not be performance of one's existing legal duty, it will not amount to be a consideration for a contract. Hence, a promise to pay money to a witness is void, for it is without consideration. Consideration must be real and not illusory. It must be something to which law attaches some value. If it is legally or physically impossible, it is not considered as a valid consideration. Consideration must not be unlawful, immoral, or opposed to public policy. It cannot be valued as a valid consideration. The cases in which the object and consideration are considered to be unlawful are: first, contract is forbidden by law. Two, contract is of such a nature that, if permitted, it would defeat the provisions of any law. Third, the contract is fraudulent. Fourth, involves injury to the person or property of another. Fifth, the court regards the contract as immoral. Sixth, the contract is opposed to public policy. In each of these cases, as the object or consideration is unlawful, it is deemed to be void. Now, with this, I'll be taking to all to the position of minor as per the Indian Contract Act. In India, the age of majority is regulated by the Indian Majority Act 1875. Every person domiciled in India shall attain the age of majority on completion of 18 years of age and not before. A minor holds a precarious position when it comes to enforceability of contracts involving minors and its ramifications. This slide captures the essential pointers. A minor is not competent to contract, and any agreement with or by a minor is void from the very beginning. A very celebrated case under this caption can be had from Privy Council in the matter of Mohir Bibi versus Dharmodas Ghosh. A minor cannot ratify the agreement on attaining the majority, as the original agreement is void ab initio and the void agreement can never be ratified. Though a minor is not competent to contract, nothing in the Contract Act prevents him from being a beneficiary. Thus, a minor cannot become a partner in a partnership firm. However, he may, with the consent of all other partners, be admitted to the benefit of partnership. A minor can always plead minority, and he is not stopped to do so when he has taken any loan or entered into any contract by falsely representing that he was major. Rule of estoppel cannot be applied against a minor. It means he cannot be allowed to plead his minority in defense. He can be allowed to plead his minority in defense. Though a minor's agreement is void, a guardian can enter into a contract on behalf of the minor. Where the guardian makes a contract for the minor, which is within his competence and which is for the benefit of the minor, there will be a valid contract which the minor can enforce. A minor's agreement being absolutely void, there can be no question of the specific performance of such an agreement. A minor cannot be declared insolvent as he is incapable of contracting. Debts and dues are payable from the personal properties of the minor, and he is not personally liable. A minor can act as an agent to the principal in a contract, but he will not be liable to his principal for his acts. A minor can draw, deliver, and endorse negotiable instruments without himself being liable. Now, with this, I'll be taking to the contract of indemnity and the contract of guarantee. The fundamental reason why we revise these cardinal principles leading to formation of contract is because special contracts of indemnity and guarantee are based on strong foundation of a validly executed contract. This slide gives us a synoptic account of how the special contracts of indemnity and guarantee have been carefully placed under Chapter 8 of the Contract Act. As we understand from the name itself, special contracts of indemnity and guarantee are the modes of seeking compensation based on certain similar principles, yet both of them differ on several issues, which we will see in due course. Let us first understand the concept of indemnity. A contract of indemnity includes two parties. One, a party who promises to indemnify and holds harmless the other party from loss or liability is referred to as indemnifier. The party who has been promised to be saved or recompensed against loss or liability is called as indemnified party or the indemnity holder. Now let us understand how the Indian Contract Act words this concept. Section 124 of the Contract Act defines contract of indemnity as a contract by which one party promises to save the other from loss caused to him by the conduct of the promisor himself or by the conduct of any other person. To put things simply, it means an agreement to protect the indemnified party from incurring any loss, to hold harmless and compensate the indemnified party who has suffered loss. Where the loss may be at the instance of an indemnitor or any other person, here all the essentials of a valid contract as discussed by us while summarizing the requisites of a contract must also be present in the contract of indemnity. The contract of indemnity is for making good the loss caused, therefore, existence of loss is essential. A person can indemnify another person only if such other person incurs some loss or it has become certain that he will incur some loss. The purpose of a contract of indemnity is to protect the indemnity holder from any loss that may be caused to him. The contract must specify that indemnity holder shall be protected from the loss caused due to action of the promisor himself, second, action of any other person, and the third, any act, event, or accident which is not in the control of parties. Now, I will quote an example. A contract of fire insurance or marine insurance is always a contract of indemnity, but a contract of life insurance is not a contract of indemnity. Let us understand the concept with a further example, which I am quoting now. X ask Y to beat Z. I repeat, X ask Y to beat Z and promises to indemnify Y against the consequences. Y beats Z and is fined rupees 1000. Y cannot claim this amount from X because the object of the agreement was unlawful. Now, after completing everything in relation to 124, I will now deal with Section 125 of the Contract Act, which deals with the rights of indemnity holder. The indemnity holder has a right to recover all the damages which he is compelled to pay in any suit in respect of any matter covered by the contract of indemnity. The indemnity holder has the right to recover all the cost which he is compelled to pay in bringing or defending such suit. Lastly, the indemnity holder has a right to recover all the sums which he has paid under the terms of a compromise of such suit in a case where the indemnifier had authorized him to compromise the suit. He can also recover all the sums that the indemnity holder may have paid to satisfy the liability of a statutory authority originally to be paid by the indemnifier. It is further clarified that a claim of indemnity is not a claim for loss or damages arising out of a breach of contract. I repeat, It is further clarified under section 125 that a claim in indemnity is not a claim for loss or damages arising out of a breach of contract, but rather is an enforcement of a debt owed to the indemnity holder in pursuance of a contract of indemnity. After understanding the concept of indemnity, let us now consider the contract of guarantee. This slide graphically demonstrates the transaction arising out of a contract of guarantee and the interpersonal relationship between the parties thereto. The person to whom guarantee is given is called as creditor. That is to say that bank or financial institutions who gives the loan or extends the loan facility is the creditor. The person in respect of whose default the guarantee is given is called principal debtor. That is to say, in common language, the borrower who avails the loan is the principal debtor. The person who gives the guarantee is called as surety. Section 126 of the Contract Act defines contract of guarantee as a contract of guarantee is a contract to perform the promise made or discharge the liability of a third person in case of his default. In this peculiar case, all the essentials of a valid contract must be present in a contract of guarantee except a few exclusions. Firstly, the moving of consideration to the benefit of principal debtor in the main contract is sufficient ground for the surety for giving the guarantee. This is reflected in section 127 of the Contract Act. Even if principal debtor is incompetent to contract, the guarantee is valid. But if surety is incompetent to contract, the guarantee is void. Now with this, I'll be taking you to the key features of contract of guarantee. Let us understand the important features of a contract of guarantee. The principal debtor must be primarily liable to pay. However, even if principal debtor is incompetent to contract, the guarantee is valid. The debt must be legally recoverable. The contract must be conditional. It is important to understand that the liability of surety is secondary and his liability arises only if the principal debtor makes a default. The creditor should disclose all the facts which are likely to affect the surety's liability. There must not be any concealment of facts. As we all know, a contract of guarantee may be either oral or written. The guarantee by surety is not valid if a condition is imposed by surety that some other person must also be joined as co-surety, but such other person does not join as a co-surety, then what are the consequences and fallouts can be had from the other sections which I will be referring hereafter. After analyzing two concepts separately, let us quickly distinguish them on the basis of some vital grounds in a tabular form as given on this slide. Now the meaning of the contract of indemnity and contract of guarantee. A contract by which one party promises to save the other from loss caused to him is called as contract of indemnity. A contract of guarantee is a contract to perform the promise or discharge the liability of a third person in case of his default. The purpose: in the matter of contract of indemnity, for the reimbursement of the loss; in the matter of contract of guarantee, for the security of the creditor. Now parties, there are only two parties in the contract of indemnity. There are three parties in the contract of guarantee: the principal debtor, creditor, and the surety. The nature of liability. The liability of the indemnifier is primary and independent. The liability of surety is secondary and conditional. The time of liability. The liability of the indemnifier arises only on the happening of a contingency. The liability is already in existence but crystallizes when the principal debtor failed to perform his part in the case of contract of guarantee. In a contract of indemnity, there is only one contract. In the contract of guarantee, there are three contracts. First, between the principal debtors and the creditor. Second, between the creditor and the surety. And a third, between surety and the principal debtor. The contract of indemnity is for the reimbursement of the loss. The contract of guarantee is for the security of the creditor. It is important to understand the nuances of the contract of guarantee. This can be studied from section 128 onwards. This slide highlights the nature and extent of the liability created in the name of surety. As per section 128, the liability of surety is coextensive with the liability of principal debtor. As stated by me here before, his liability, his means the surety's liability arises only upon the default of the principal debtor. The liability of the surety continues even if principal debtor has not been sued. The liability of surety arises immediately on the default by the principal debtor. The creditor is not required either to sue the principal debtor or give a notice to the principal debtor. Surety's liability may be limited up to which the guarantee shall remain effective. Surety's liability may be continuous in the nature as provided under section 129. He may agree to become liable for a series of transactions of continuous nature. The essence of a continuing guarantee is that it applies the surety to be liable for unpaid balance under all such transactions. His liability continues till the performance or discharge of all transactions entered into between the creditor and the principal debtor or till the guarantee is withdrawn. However, the surety may fix a limit on his liability up to which the guarantee shall remain effective. And secondly, a time period during which the guarantee shall remain effective. Surety's liability may be conditional until those conditions are met, the surety shall not be liable. This flowchart captures several provisions which broadly provides for three different modes by which the liability of surety may be discharged. These modes are to be read in conjunction with other provisions of the Contract Act. Therefore, it is crucial to understand them in some detail. The surety may be discharged by revocation of the guarantee expressly or by necessary circumstances. As per section 130 of the Contract Act, a continuing guarantee may be revoked at any time by the surety by giving a notice to the creditor. However, a revocation shall be effective only in respect of future transactions. The liability of the surety with regard to previous transactions shall remain unaffected. Now, I'll be taking you to section 131, which deals with the death of the surety operates as a revocation of the continuing guarantee as to future transactions. The conduct of the creditor may cause discharge of the sureties when there is a variance in the terms of contract between the creditor and the principal debtor without the consent of the surety. It would discharge the surety in respect of all transactions taking place subsequent to such variance. Friends, when the creditor and principal debtor borrower proceeds to alter, modify, substitute, or change the terms of the contract entirely without the consent and concurrence and knowledge of the surety, then it is necessary for us to consider its interplay with section 62 of the Contract Act to understand the concept of novation and alteration of contract. A contract is discharged by mutual agreement in following ways. If the parties to a contract agree to substitute a new contract for it, or to rescind, or to alter it, the original contract need not be performed. Now I'll be dealing with what is the concept and what is the definition of novation. The parties to a contract may substitute a new contract for the old. If they do so, it will be a case of novation. On novation, the old contract is discharged completely and consequently it need not be performed. Now, I'll be taking you to the alteration, the meaning and the concept of alteration. The terms of contract may be altered by mutual agreement that the alteration may have the effect of substituting a new contract for the old one. In other words, the distinction between the novation and alteration is very slender. The difference between novation and alteration can be had from this slide. In novation, substitution of existing contract with the new one. In the alteration, the terms of the contract may be altered by mutual agreement by the contracting parties. Novation may be between the same parties or there may be a change in the contracting parties. The parties to the contract will remain the same in alteration. There is altogether a substitution of new contract in place of old contract in novation. It is not essential to substitute a new contract in place of old contract. There may be a change in some of the terms and conditions of the original contract in the matter of alteration. Next slide, please. Coming to the modes of discharge, that is section 134 stipulates that the surety may be discharged by any contract between the creditor and the principal debtor by which the principal debtor is released. Alternatively, the surety may be discharged in a case where, by an act or omission of the creditor, the legal consequence of which leads to the discharge of principal debtor. Now I will quote example. A contracts to build a house for B for a fixed price within a stipulated time. B to supply necessary timber. C guarantees the performance of A to the contract. In the event where B omits to supply the timber, C is discharged from his suretyship. In a contract between the creditor and principal debtor, if the creditor makes an accommodation or promises to give time to or not to sue the principal debtor, then the surety is discharged unless the surety assents to such contract and agrees to be bound by it. This discharge is captured under section 135 of the Contract Act. Section 139 creates a saving provision for the surety in case the creditor does any act which is inconsistent with the rights of the surety or omits to do any act dutifully toward the surety, thereby impairing the eventual remedy against the principal debtor, the surety is deemed to be discharged. Now that we are on the aspect of discharge of surety's responsibilities under the contract, let us understand the ways in which discharge of contract can be sought by the party to the contract. The surety may be discharged in the event of invalidation of the contract of guarantee. The three provisions can be had from this slide. Section 142, read with section 18, states that any guarantee obtained by misrepresentation of a material part of transaction made either by the creditor himself or by some other person with the knowledge and assent of the creditor is invalid. Additionally, under section 143, if any guarantee is obtained by the creditor by keeping silence or expressly concealing the material circumstances, then such a guarantee is tainted and suffers from an invalidity. Let us understand this by an example. A engages B as a clerk to collect money for him. B fails to account for some of his receipts, and A in consequence calls upon him to furnish security for his duly accounting. C gives guarantee for B's duly accounting. A does not acquaint C. With B's previous conduct, B thereafter makes default, the guarantee is invalid. As stated here before by me, if a person has given a guarantee on condition that it shall not be effective until another person has joined as co-surety, the guarantee shall not be valid unless the said person does not join as surety. This will discharge the surety who has given his guarantee to satisfy the liability in the main contract. A contract act specifically gives three provisions clarifying the cases in which the surety will not be discharged and will have to bear the liability on default of the principal debtor. This slide covers those provisions of undischarged sureties. In the event the creditor enters into a contract with a third person to grant some concession of time to the principal debtor in the repayment of debt under section 136, the surety is not discharged. The accommodation provided to the principal debtor does not relieve the surety of its responsibility under the contract of guarantee. As per section 137, any restraint or forbearance on the part of creditor from suing the principal debtor or its omission to take enforcement measures against the debtor does not discharge the surety from its liability. The surety will remain liable unless there is any provision to the contrary in the contract of guarantee. Section 138 contemplates two things. Co-sureties are not discharged when one of them is discharged. The release co-surety is not absolved of its responsibilities to other co-sureties. This is very important. Proceeding, next slide please. Proceeding on the premise that the liability of the surety persists, it is relevant to note the rights. It is relevant to note the rights that the surety is empowered with under the Contract Act. This pictorial representation on the slide indicates that he can exercise his right against the principal debtor, the creditor, and the other sureties, co-sureties. Let us understand them step by step. Once a guaranteed debt has become due and there is a default by the principal debtor to perform its duty of the repayment, the surety will have to perform his part by paying the debt guaranteed by him. Upon doing so, the surety is virtually invested with all the rights which the creditor has against the principal debtor. The word invested, I repeat, the word invested in the section dispenses with the necessity of any written assignment or transfer of the rights. This bunch of rights can be exercised by the surety via its inherent right of subrogation. In every contract of guarantee, there is an implied promise by the principal debtor to indemnify the surety. The surety is entitled to recover from the principal debtor any sum paid by him under the guarantee by exercising its right of indemnity. The example for this can be B is indebted to C and A is surety for the debt. C demands payment from A and on his refusal sues him for the amount. A defends the suit having reasonable grounds for doing so, but is compelled to pay the amount of debt with cost. He can recover from B the amount paid by him for cost as well as the principal debt. Thus, the surety is indemnified by the implied promise of the principal debtor to pay the debt raised by him. A surety gets a right to demand all securities held by the creditor while advancing the loan guaranteed by the surety. He can call upon all those securities to recover the sum paid by him under the contract of guarantee. In the process, it is immaterial as to whether the surety had the knowledge of existence of such securities or not. In the event The creditor loses certain securities or parts with the security. Without the consent of the surety, the liability of the surety is discharged to the extent of the value of securities so returned, lost, or parted with. It is the general rule that when a debt or duty is guaranteed by two or more sureties, and one of them pays more than his share of that debt or performs the duty, he is entitled to compel the contribution from the other surety or sureties, whether they are bound jointly or severally or under the same contract or different contracts. As an exception, the co-sureties may fix limits on their respective liabilities. Even in such a case, the co-surety shall contribute equally, subject to maximum time limit fixed by co-sureties. Let us take an example for understanding this rule. A, B, and C are the sureties to D for the sum of rupees 3 lakhs lent to E. E makes a default in the payment. Therefore, A, B, and C are liable as between themselves to pay rupees 1000 each. If the co-sureties are bound in different limits of liabilities, they must pay equally as far as their agreed obligation permits. For example, A, B, and C as sureties for D enter into three separate bonds, each in a different penalty. Namely, A in the penalty of rupees 1 lakh, B in that of rupees 2 lakhs, and C in the penalty of rupees 4 lakhs, conditioned for D's duly accounting to E. D makes a default to the extent of rupees 3 lakhs. A, B, and C each are liable to pay rupees 1 lakh. Friends, we have covered chapter 8 in extenso and learnt about the law on special contracts of indemnity and guarantee. Before I conclude, I wish to thank my associates Sri Nikhil Runwal and Harish Advant for extending me the support needed for this webinar. With this, I complete my session and hand over the reins to my co-speaker, Dr. Sheetal Barahate. Thank you so much.